There. So I wanted to take a few minutes today to really focus in on Psalm of Life, which is the poem that I introduced you to a couple of days ago. The reason I wanted to take a few minutes today and just focus in on that was because the next lesson, which I'm going to try really hard to post on Monday, we're going to focus in on the other poem, The Tide Rises and the Tide Falls. And then on Wednesday, we're going to talk about how you can see the difference between these two works, and you can also see remnants of the fact that, yes, the same person did in fact write these poems. So let's talk about The Psalm of Life by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So as you remember, the Psalm of Life was written when Longfellow was young. He was a young man. He was in his 30s. He wrote it and dedicated it to the wife that he lost when she miscarried their child. I think he kind of wrote it as a way to inspire himself to keep going. So in that very first stanza, he deals with the idea that life is sometimes sad. Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream. For the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem. So immediately he comes out of the gate and he says, don't talk to me and say that life is not worth living or that life is about sadness, because that is not what life is about. So it's right out of the gate. You can feel that youthful energy and that positive inspiration. And then he says, life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returnest, was not spoken of the soul. So here he is saying, listen, do we die at the end of our life? Yes, but that is not the purpose of life. The purpose of life is not to die. The purpose of life is to live. And so he immediately says, life is real, life is earnest. And so what we do every day, that's what we're supposed to be focused on. And again, you feel that positive energy just flowing from him. Not enjoyment and not sorrow is our destined end or way, but to act that each tomorrow find us further than today. This sort of gives you an insight on how Longfellow looked at life. So he looked at life like a marathon. He's not saying, life is not about happiness or about sadness. It's about the life, the living. You are going to be sad. You are going to be happy. But it's the mixture of the two that creates this life that we live. And he says something that I have found always very, very inspiring. He says, life is about acting as if that each tomorrow, so every day that we wake up, we're a little further than we were the day before. I think in times like these where I think many of us feel kind of stuck and we're in the house and there's nothing to do and there's nothing on television and I've read every book and, I feel like that's kind of what he's saying. Listen, sometimes you just have to say, well, I did this today, so tomorrow I'm going to be a little further ahead. And then he says, art is long and time is fleeting, and our hearts, though stout and brave, still like muffled drums are beating funeral marches to the grave. I've always loved that line. It's a little morbid, but what he's kind of saying is that with every heartbeat that we have, we grow closer to the last heartbeat, right? In Hamlet, we learn Hamlet has this really long discussion. Hamlet is a play by Shakespeare, if you don't know that. My seniors have read it or are reading it. In Hamlet, he has this discussion with Hortensio that, when we're born, we start to die. As the day we're born, we start our journey towards death. And as morbid as that sounds, it's how Hamlet saw life. He saw life as every day. And when Longfellow says this, time is fleeting, time's fast. As long as time seems right now, and I bet for some of you, time seems really long. As long as it seems right now, it will not be this long. It will not. It's going to be very fast. And I think you'll be surprised when this is all over and we're all back to school in August and we all look back and say, holy cow, do you remember when we had to do this? It's going to seem like it was a million years ago and it's going to seem like it went, but I got to tell you right now, it does not seem that way. He says art is long, which I love too, because, poetry is an art form, right? And so he says art is long, and look that we're reading his poem, a poem he wrote over 100 years ago. You and I are talking about right now. That is some stamina, ladies and gentlemen. In the world's broad field of battle, in the bivouac of life, Be not like dumb, driven cattle. Be a hero in the strife. I love that stanza. He is saying here, don't be a follower. Don't necessarily be a leader. You don't have to be a general, but don't be a follower. Don't be somebody who's going to do something just because someone else tells you to do it. It's a beautiful metaphor, right? Don't be like dumb, driven cattle. Beautiful. Actually, that's a simile because he uses like. Then he says, trust no future, however pleasant. Let the dead past bury its dead. Act. Act in the living present. Heart within and God o'erhead. I don't necessarily know that he actually meant like Christian God overhead. I think he sort of meant like conscience. Like act in a way that you would be proud to display in front of anyone, anytime, any day. When I was really young, my grandmother used to always tell me to never write anything down, that I was not okay with being on the front page of the Bangor Daily News the next day, knowing that she and my grandfather would be the first people to read it. And that was a life-changing moment for me. When social media became social media, I can remember thinking that when I was a teenager, my grandmother would have said, don't do anything that you would not want to see posted on Facebook the next day, knowing that your grandfather and I would be the first ones to see it. For whatever reason, our grandparents, for most of us, have a really special place in our hearts. And to disappoint Grammy would have been horrible, like awful horrible. It would have just killed me. And so I think that's what he's talking about. He's saying, remember that everything we do, we need to do with a good conscience, a good soul, because at some point we're going to be held accountable for those actions. Not necessarily like in the afterlife. You're held accountable for your actions in the now life. So that's, I think, what he's saying. This is my favorite stanza. Lives of great men all remind us that we can be sublime, and leaving behind us footprints in the sands of time. Of all of his stanzas, I love that stanza. The idea that our lives aren't just about us, that they are about others. Lives of great men remind us we can make our lives sublime. Sublime means amazing and wonderful and awe-inspiring. And I think of men, especially men from the Revolution and from the Civil Rights Movement, and women who went above and beyond. And some of my teachers that I had when I was your age, I just think about those people and what they had to do and what they had to go through to be who they are. And wow, like that's amazing. Lives of great people remind us we can all be sublime. I don't think Martin Luther King knew he was going to be Martin Luther King when he was 10, but he was a great man. Abraham Lincoln didn't know he was going to completely annihilate slavery when he was 12, but he did. It's amazing to think that all those amazing men and women, Rosa Parks, those were all kids like you. And they become these great men and women who led movements, who changed the world. And they were children at one point. And then he says, footprints that perhaps another, sailing o'er life's solemn main, a forlorn and shipwrecked brother, seeing shall take heart again. And I think this is where we kind of see a little bit of Longfellow's soul and his purpose. He lost his wife and he lost his baby, and that must have been absolutely heart-wrenching. And I think that what he was saying here was that he knew that he wasn't the only person who had experienced that he knew that there were other people who had experienced this loss, who were struggling with this. And he really felt like the way he faced it and the way he overcame it and the way he got better from it would help anyone behind him who was then going to have to face it just like he did. It's the idea that we are here for each other. That's why we're on earth. We're on earth for each other, so that if someone needs us, our footprints are there. When I read this when I was your age, I used to always think, sands, yes, I had been to beaches and I'd seen footprints in the sands of time, but I more thought like, how when you're little and you're taking a walk with your parents in the snow and like it's really deep, and so your father takes a step and he like goes all the way down, and so as a kid you're trying to like stretch to take that one footprint so that you don't have to get yourself all snowy and wet. I always had that image in my head when I saw it, that those footprints are there so that your journey might be a little easier. and not as hard. And I always sort of saw that as Longfellow's soul. Like he really wanted to help and he wanted to show people that recovery was possible, that healing was possible. Let us then be up and doing with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. And I think here he's talking about the grieving process. By this point, when he wrote this poem, by the way, by this point he was remarried. And his second wife was a wonderful woman, and they were very, very happy together, and they had several children. But I think that the grief process that he went through with his first wife really made Longfellow the poet he was. Unlike a lot of poets, Longfellow was popular in his own time, very popular, very wealthy. People loved him. They ate up his poems like candy. They couldn't wait to read another one. Just a really neat story. And I don't know if I mentioned it. I listened to my thing that I mentioned yesterday, but he was a Mainer. He was born in Portland, Maine. His house is still in Portland, Maine. You could actually go, not right now, but you could go and do tours of his house. I had lunch. I had a picnic lunch in his backyard a few years ago. That was really special for me because, of course, I love him, and so that was really neat. If you go to the Portland Lighthouse, there's a rock there that he used to sit on when he wrote. So they've immortalized that, and there's this big plaque that says this is his rock, and it was one of his favorite places to go and be inspired. So he's a really neat author, and I love the idea that he's from Maine. Stephen King's from Maine, and that's always been really great for us. But and there are so many New England literature giants. But Longfellow's ours. He's from Maine. He's ours. So that is A Psalm of Life. And again, young 30s, just getting over the death of his first wife, his first child. I want you to really think about the positivity he felt here. I feel like, I tell you guys this all the time, words for me, it's like a warm bath. You're surrounded in this beautiful language, and Longfellow is a beautiful example of that. I don't know that you could find a better example of that than Psalm of Life. Most of you who emailed me back said that this was your favorite of the two, which I knew because it's my favorite of the two, but it's almost every student I've ever taught, it's their favorite of the two. So the next lesson, we're actually going to go back and we're going to talk about the tide rises and the tide falls, and then we'll do a lesson on sort of side by side comparing them. So that's going to be fun. So I'll see you on Monday. I miss your faces. I hope this is over very soon, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I'll talk to you Monday, okay? Bye.